Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, Wine, Spirits, and Beverages, Failure Modes, Risk Prevention, Tips and Tools to Prevent Losses with Your Product. This webinar today will be hosted by Valerie Weiler, Director of Client and Sample Management at Eurofins SF Analytical in New Berlin, and Martha Kimber, Senior Technical Manager, Eurofins Advanced Food Microbiology. I'm Amy Knock, and I'll be moderating this webinar today. That now concludes my brief introduction. Today, Val, I will pass it off to you. You may begin the presentation.
Thanks, Amy. So today we're going to go over a brief overview of wine and beverage failure analysis and your risk prevention. I'm going to do an introduction, and then we're going to do a presentation regarding identifying and managing your failure risk, some laboratory considerations you may want to take into account. We're going to briefly go over analytical techniques that would be used in this type of analysis, and then go over case studies so you have a good idea of how we would use those analytical techniques in real world situations. So for today's webinar, as Amy said, my name is Valerie Weiler. I'm the Director of Client and Sample Management here at Eurofins SF Analytical. And presenting with me is Martha Kimber, the Senior Technical Manager at Eurofins Advanced Microbiology in Fresno, California. So just very briefly, Eurofins is a worldwide network of labs. We have over 700 labs worldwide. You can see a brief map here, high concentration in Europe, as well as several labs across the US. Here's a brief overview of the different types of labs that we have within the US, and this is within the US Foods division. We also have divisions for pharma and environmental. So we have labs for nutrition, supplements, contaminants, product design, dairy, and microbiology, and specifically our groups are in the specialty section, and as well as the advanced food microbiology. I am in the Eurofins SF Analytical lab, so we are in New Berlin, Wisconsin. We also have a sister lab in Tustin, California. Between the two locations, we have over 40 scientists, including 3 with PhDs, more than $7 million of state-of-the-art instrumentation, including GC, LC, IC. We specialize specifically in problem-solving and investigative-based analysis. We really pride ourselves in being the non-routine lab. So anything that doesn't fit neatly into your normal test code catalog comes to us, and we help to find the solution for the problem. We began doing this type of work in the early 70s. And have been doing it quite a bit lately, continuing. So our lab, we specialize, as I said, in specialty testing. We're really the lab to call when you need that missing piece. We have multiple labs that do nutritional analysis and other types, but for a more of a puzzle solving lab, we are the go-to.
So a little bit about the Advanced Food Micro team. We're located in Fresno, California. We have a long heritage in food products. We were formerly called the National Food Lab, the National Food Products Association, and we are also named the Grocery Manufacturers of America. But overall, our core group has remained the same, and we've been doing the same function. We're kind of the counterpart that does micro to the SFA group that Valerie was talking about. So basically, we're 5 project leaders and 5 lab operations staff, and we have over 120 years combined experience. We have a BSL-2 laboratory and a very extensive culture collection of pathogenic and spoilage organism strains. And overall, projects come to us when no one knows where to send them. So if you're looking for a research question, if you have a root cause investigation, if you just kind of want to do proof in concept, we can help that. And we do these custom fit type studies. And we serve clients both domestically and internationally. And overall, I would say our core services are that we provide research, regulatory guidance, and process authority support. And we've been doing so since the mid-70s. All right, so let's take a look at identifying and managing your risk for failures. So annual losses for wine, spirits, and beverages are estimated to be about $2.5 billion a year in the United States. And about 2 billion of that is for wine alone in the US. And then the remaining is about 500 million a year for distilled spirits and other high value beverages such as energy drinks, protein shakes, infant formula, dietary supplements. And the US FDA estimates that a single product recall may cost the company around $10 million. So big picture, your risk is huge. It can be very costly, and product package and supply chain issues are contributing factors for failures. All right, so how can we identify these risks? Risk is unavoidable and ever evolving. So different types of changes such as pandemic, climate change, regulatory updates, evolving consumer demands, all these changes can lead to shortages of labor and supplies, which can increase your risk. So to start identifying your hazards, you want to look upstream first. So you want to look at those ingredients, your packaging, your processing aids. You also want to look at your overall process. Look at your co-packer and your process for manufacturing. Some examples of spoilage failures for beverages include microbiological, improper storage, UV exposure, contamination, and process or packaging failure. And some of the causes of processing failures include kind of pushing out all these new and novel product types. For example, I've seen clients where they're used to doing carbonated beverages and they're moving into still beverage. They don't quite know the risks associated with doing still beverages versus carbonated, and they don't take the time, or maybe they're too rushed to identify them. Another cause could be the increased use of co-packers. There's also an increased consumer demand for certain types of products, such as alcoholic and non-alcoholic mocktails. Everyone's in a rush and they want to launch their product quickly, and sometimes they don't have time to do stability studies or other background work for the new product. And sometimes they have under-tested or green packaging types that are biodegradable, and they don't quite know how they're going to perform with their product. And finally, another cause could be lack of validation for their new product and process. Some examples of risks that we see pretty often here include storage issues, so leaching from the storage receptacle, leaching from the packaging, just holding improperly or too long, or product incompatibility with the container. Another example would be improper cleaning, like perhaps they're using insufficient rinsing procedure or a new cleaning agent. There's also just good old-fashioned user error. So poor hygiene, handling errors, improperly trained staff, issues with calibration or quality control. There can also be processing failures or improper or incomplete pasteurization, equipment failure, cross-contamination. There can also be ingredient issues, so changes in quality from maybe a new ingredient supplier are pretty common. All right, so what could happen if one of these failures occur? So fraud and adulteration. One of the most common reasons for recalls from the FDA is undeclared allergens, but also unknown materials, colorants, drugs, and other ingredients. You could have packaging failures with spoilage and loss of product. You can have market withdrawals or recalls, product rejections and quarantines, harm to consumers, negative publicity, which causes damage to your brand and reputation, and even legal action. So yeah, big picture, these failures can cause loss of your business and overall loss of trust in your brand.
So next section I'm going to go through is what you want to look for in identifying an analytical partner. And this is really important to make sure that you have the right fit for the testing that you need. So what you want to look for is a specialized testing lab. Likely you're doing a certain amount of kind of routine testing, release testing, quality control. Those labs are wonderful, but they are not always going to be the best fit for when there's an error or there's a failure where you need more of a specialized investigation. what you want to look for. So your routine lab is really going to focus on certain types of samples. It's going to be more high throughput, more routine. They're definitely going to have a good experience in that nutritional, everything on the nutritional label, allergen testing. When there is an issue, you want to look for a non-routine testing lab. It's a little more specialized. So they're going to specialize in looking at obscure problems. You look for a lab that has a large R&D team, lots of different techniques that they're able to use. You don't want a lab that's going to go through, they say, oh, here is the test code for this solution. You want someone who's going to look at using an orthogonal approach, because that's going to give you the best answer. And really look for someone, a lab that has experience in doing this type of testing. So specialized testing labs, by and large, really want to look for someone who's going to have no conflict of interest. Commonly, a failure analysis may have implications on kind of recouping some losses from a co-packer or insurance claims. You want to really make sure that that lab that you're using doesn't have, isn't on both sides of the fence. Ask for client references. Can they provide, ask around to the other players in your market and see who they're using. Really want to make sure they're going to be confidential, willingness to sign an NDA. If there's going to be any legal implications, make sure they're experienced with attorney-client privilege and are able to provide that expertise and that legal support if you need it. The other thing you want to look for is, do they have a good process in place for chain of custody and secure storage? At our facility, we have a very specific chain of custody form. We have everything that's under, legal or insurance claim is under lock and key, and a very need-to-know basis. We have the that specific drive where all the data is stored is, there's only a few individuals that have access, just to make sure that everything is kept as confidential as possible. The thing to look for is, what are their capabilities? What analytical techniques and instrumentation do they have available? Do they have what you're going to need? Are they trying to shoehorn something in to make it work? Are they certified? Is it an ISO certified lab? Do they have the experience and the technical credibility to really give you the answers that you need and to satisfy the other side? The other is, are they going to turn this around quickly? Are they sensitive to how quickly you need this answer? Often when there is a failure, it is a crisis situation. We have had instances where we have dropped everything, worked around the clock to make sure that we can get the answer quickly. To know, means you just need to know, like, how bad is the issue? What do I need to quarantine? What can I release? If you've got things sitting in a warehouse, that space is expensive. The other is there capacity instrumentation? What you don't want in a specialty lab is they say, oh, sure, we can help you in 6 months. This is generally, when you're looking at failures, these are more crisis instances, and you want to be able to get your answer quickly. So looking for a lab that is sensitive to that and is able to provide that for you. The other thing you want to kind of note as you're talking to a lab that you're looking for is, what questions are they asking? Do they have a canned response, or are they listening to what your situation is? In most cases, these are going to be tailored to the situation at hand, and a one-size-fits-all isn't going to work. The other thing you want to make sure is that that lab is familiar with whatever regulatory environment that you need your testing to be completed. So what do you want to look for in the end? So the results that you want in the end, you want to look for someone who's going to be able to provide you the data, but also help you interpret it and give a nice written report. When we provide data for investigations, a C of A is great, but it's not going to give you the answer in this case. Really, you want to look for a kind of thorough report of, here's everything that was done, here's how it was done, here's the interpretation. We pride ourselves in providing access to our scientists, from the beginning if necessary, all the way through to the end. We're willing to get on a call after the results are in to make sure that everybody understands what we found and what can be used with it. The other thing is, we'll help you determine that root cause. If we're able to provide it up front, or we can do kind of consultation after the fact. Once we know what the issue is, all right, we're here to help you solve your problem. We don't want to walk away when the result is sent. We want to make sure that you have the answers that you need to be able to move forward with your business. Another thing that we provide and what you really want to look for in a lab is someone who's willing to stand up with you. If you need to go to court, if you need to go to, your supplier, to make sure that they're going to stand behind the results and are willing to put kind of their their results out there in testimony, because that really means that they stand behind what they're doing. I'm going to briefly go over some analytical capabilities. I'm not going to go into too much into depth here. The reason being is I want to really highlight how we use those analytical techniques in the case studies. So I'm just going to go through them briefly here just to give a background. So the first set of techniques that we have at our disposal is moisture pH titrations. And this can give you information on pH is very important, and titrations can be used for alkalinity to determine, is that changing over time? Is the pH and the alkalinity appropriate for the packaging that is in, is where this is most used. Thermography, so we use DSC and TGA. So DSC is going to look at the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of a sample. So kind of looks at the thermal stability. And then TGA is going to see how that changes over time. So it's going to be able to tell if something is heated and cooled, is there any issues with the materials themselves. Microscopy and spectroscopy, we have at our disposal a Keyes microscope. They can go to 2000x magnification. It also has a laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy. Really what it is, it's a laser that can pulse the samples while it's on the microscope stage and give you the elemental breakdown. So it isn't necessarily a mapping like EDX would be, but it is that exact location that you have pulsed the laser. What is that elemental composition? And this is really nice because you can kind of pulse down into a layer. So if you have something that has multiple layers, you can do pulses throughout the layers to see what is the elemental composition as those layers change. You can also look at different locations within the material. SEM EDX is really going to be great for looking at the surface morphology and how the elements change on the surface. FTIR, we're going to use organics primarily and some select organics. So it's going to measure the absorption of the IR. And we were able to compare that against, we have a library of over 100,000 contaminants that we can then compare that to. And that's able to, for us, give some identification. This is great for tiny particles, specifically, foreign materials is where this comes into play a lot. Raman is going to measure the light scattering. And this is useful for things that you can't look at with an IR, particularly crystal forms. We use ICP for elemental detection, either OES or MS, depending on what the mineral or metal is and how low the detection needs to be. Mass spec is obviously going to give a lower detection. OES is going to be used more for minerals. Think sodium, calcium, magnesium. Chromatography, we have multiple instrumentations for chromatography. GC and LC are the most that are going to be used in failure analysis. So for GC, that's going to be everything that's volatile. This comes in great when it's an off flavor and off odor, because if you can smell it, it's probably volatile. So we have MS and FID detectors there. And I'll go into some more details of how we've used those in the case studies. Liquid chromatography is going to be for your non-volatile components. We have UV mass spec and then a high resolution mass spec, which is able to do untargeted analysis.
All right, so when you are doing a root cause investigation or a cause of spoilage where it's suspected microbiological spoilage, we have a variety of techniques that we have at our disposal in our lab. We generally use methods from the compendium or the FDA BAM, which is an analytical method manual from the FDA. But we can use all of these kind of concurrently and at our disposal, depending on what the situation is looking like. The way that I normally start with these types of studies is I review information about the product, about the incidence of spoilage. It's a very different situation if it's maybe 1 or 2% of a lot versus 80 or 90% of your lot. And that can give you a clue as to what the root cause might be. We also ask for background information on the packing dates, processing records, cooling and sanitation records, etc. We observe the packaging for defects because that If you see defects, that can sometimes indicate that post-process contamination has occurred. We also look at spoiled samples as well as an unspoiled control sample. And we start out by looking at pH, appearance, odor, and a microscopic examination. And then we also can do a variety of subculturing techniques, again, often from the compendium, but we can do other things as well. So looking for aerobic versus anaerobic organisms, mesophilic versus thermophilic, or spore formers versus heat labile. Once you get these categories, it's a lot easier to start identifying what the root cause might be. And we can do further characterization of the isolates on various selective media. And we can also do genetic identification as well. So 16S RNA sequencing, we can also do whole genome sequencing. I put if applicable here because sometimes going straight to genetic ID is not helpful and actually can put you into more of a crisis than you're hoping for. For example, if you identify a pathogen with your genetic ID, then you're immediately in a recall situation. But if you look at your general characterization and say you find coliforms, you know that you can do a market withdrawal and you're not necessarily in that crisis recall mode. So that's why I put if applicable there. A couple of different types of studies that we can do to prevent failures include antimicrobial efficacy studies, pathogen and spoilage organism challenge studies. Again, we design these based on the National Advisory Committee for Microbiological Criteria for Foods, or NACMAF. They have a guidance document as well as FDA guidance. We can do process validations, so that could include thermal processing, high pressure processing, other types of novel processes like UV and whatnot. This photo here is actually a picture of Anne working on our pilot scale HPP unit, which we have in our laboratory. So that's an example of something that we can do benchtop, in our laboratory. We can inoculate your product with pathogens, run it through our HPP in the lab to see how your product will perform, for example. We can also go on site for process validations if you want to run it on your actual equipment. In that case, we would not work with pathogens, but we could work with surrogates that are non-pathogenic. And finally, we're a recognized process authority for foods and beverages, and we're knowledgeable about the FDA requirements. So we can help guide you to prevent possible failures, whether that be issues with spoilage or pathogens, or also maybe confusion with the FDA requirements. But overall, in order to prevent risk, you want to understand your product and process, because that is key. That is key to your failure prevention. All right, so now we're going to get to a couple different case studies. This first one is pretty straightforward, but we had a client who was panicking. A very high percentage of his sangria was having issues with gas production. So whenever they would open the bottles, there would be foaming. And he wanted to determine the cause of spoilage. So our approach was pretty straightforward here. We looked, at the product under the microscope. We did some subculturing. We also did a little bit of genetic identification. And the result solution here, pretty straightforward again. We recovered spoilage yeast. This really should have been addressed by the tunnel pasteurization that was applied to the sangria product. So we had the client kind of dig a little bit deeper and talk to their co-packer. They reviewed their batching records, and they found that there had been delays of several days between the batching and processing. So what had occurred was actually incipient spoilage, which is where organisms were able to grow and multiply in the product before that kill step had occurred. And there were such high levels of yeast that they overwhelmed the thermal process, and some portion of that population survived the thermal process. So these results helped give our client data to work with their co-packers so that they could set up guardrails around their holding procedures to prevent that incipient spoilage from occurring prior to processing. All right, so for our next case study, this is an energy drink where they were finding that this fruit punch would change from red to yellow. Their grape product would change from purple to blue. This color change was happening over a 4-month production period. However, in their internal testing lab, the product pH, packaging, odor, and everything else was otherwise normal, just this color change. When they plated it onto aerobic plate count, when they were doing aerobic plate count testing, they didn't recover any microorganisms. So our approach here again was pretty straightforward. We did the microscopic examination, subculturing, and genetic ID. And what we found was we recovered Lactobacillus paracasei, which is very heat labile and should not survive the process that was applied to this product. So we were able to determine that it was post-process contamination. And then again, we dug a little bit deeper and we were able to find that there was a biofilm causing contamination of this product that had existed between that 4-month period. And the biofilm was there between the exit of the pasteurization hold tube and the filler bowl. Their products contain red 40, which is an azo dye, and many species of lactobacillus can modify the tartrazine in azo dyes under anaerobic conditions. And because this organism prefers to grow anaerobically, that's why they weren't able to pick it up with their APC testing. So we helped our client update their sanitation SOPs and help them determine that routine APC testing would not necessarily be sufficient to monitor for this micro concern. So we were able to help them also with their finished product testing protocols. Our next case study is about an off flavor in a carbonated beverage. This client was getting off flavors during a period of about 4 to 5 months post-production, but the product appearance, pH, and packaging was otherwise normal. So no gas production or anything like that. Again, pretty straightforward approach here, so microscopic examination and subculturing. And the results. So we recovered Alicyclobacillus from the spoiled samples. Alicyclobacillus is a thermophile that produces spores, and it can survive your typical thermal processes, and you can't really process it out of your product because it's thermophilic. It would require such a severe process that your product would be undrinkable if you were to do that. And the off flavors that it causes when it grows in your product are medicinal, antiseptic, phenolic flavors. So then we helped the client do some additional testing for their ingredients for the affected batches. And we found pretty moderate levels of ACB spores in the pineapple concentrate, which was inoculating each batch during that time period. So we helped the client implement an ingredient quality program and spec to prevent this issue moving forward. All right, so this case study is kind of to illustrate how we can help you prevent failures from occurring. So this client was developing a brand new product and they wanted to determine their spoilage risk in their preservative-free alcoholic cocktails. And the ingredients included their alcoholic spirit, fruit juice, flavors, and some of the SKUs were carbonated. So for this instance, we did an inoculated challenge study with a multi-strain cocktail of spoilage yeast to determine if growth or spoilage would occur if those yeasts were present in the product under ambient conditions. The results of the study indicated that the yeast populations declined over time, so the spoilage did not occur. And these results gave the client their flexibility to use different co-packing options. They wanted to consider both tunnel pasteurization as well as a batch pasteurization with an ambient fill. So this just gave them overall a lot more flexibility. All right, this was an odd one. And again, this is helping prevent issues, but more from a regulatory standpoint. So they had a dairy-based liqueur, and they wanted to apply a thermal process that was sufficient to kill vegetative pathogens, such as E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella, and, most typical yeast, mold, lactics, things like that. However, the thermal process was not sufficient to kill the spore-forming bacteria. So the client wanted to understand their risk for food safety and spoilage due to those spore formers, and some examples of spore-forming bacteria that can produce toxin or Bacillus cereus and Clostridium botulinum. So our approach here, we did a combination of a review of scientific literature regarding these spore formers and the alcohol level, and we also did inoculated challenge studies with these spore formers. The results, so the growth of pathogens in spoilage spore formers did not occur in our challenge study, and we were also able to back that up with scientific literature. And as a deliverable for this project, we provided a process authority letter summarizing our results and conclusions regarding the overall microsafety and stability of the product formulation. All right, so this is another way to prevent a failure from occurring. So a client wanted to make a cocktail containing a juice-based concentrate plus a spirit. And they wanted flexibility to hold the concentrate during batching and before they add the spirit ingredient. So what we did was we did an inoculated challenge study with the concentrates with and without the preservative that they were thinking of using. We incubated them at ambient temperature for up to 10 days. So that was a little bit beyond the batching time that they were thinking might happen. And then our target organisms for the study were lactic acid bacteria, yeast, and mold. All right, and as you see with the results, the concentrate with their preservative system, all these organisms fell below the limit of detection or died off and did not rebound over the storage period. However, when the product did not contain that preservative system, growth of lactic acid bacteria occurred over the storage period, but the mold levels remained relatively stable. So overall, the preservative system gave the client a little bit more flexibility with their batching hold times prior to adding their high-proof spirit.
Thank you, Martha. That was very informative. I think that that really gives a good broad overview of the different types and ways that your lab can help support clients. I'm going to go into a little bit of more of the chemistry analytical techniques to give just a different, a different viewpoint. So the first case study I'm going to go over is a foreign material. So for this, the client observed a foreign material in the spirit. So some particles were observed in the spirit itself, as well as on the surface of the cork. And what we did in this case was to look at the particles on the cork. So we isolated some particles in the spirit as well as on the surface of the cork, and then compared that to a control bottle of spirit and a control cork. And the control bottle showed no particles on the cork, and the control cork actually had a thin clear coating that was not present on the suspect cork that had the particulates on it. In this case, we used FTIR to analyze the different particles and compare them to each other. So what you see over here on the top is white particles that were scraped from the cork, and we actually did an FTIR of the control cork and used that as a blank to subtract out. So we removed any of the information that was coming from the cork itself, so we could just isolate the material that was on the cork. And what we compared that to, it was consistent with urochromide, and that is a slip additive used in plastic manufacturing. Clearly there's some amount of that particulate that was contaminating. In this next case study, a freshly manufactured batch of vanilla smoothie was reported to have an off odor. Some people described it as a solvent-like. In these types of cases, we really try to get as much information as we can, with the caveat that what the consumer describes as chemically or off is not always what we would describe it, or what a trained panelist that's using sensory data would describe it as. But it gives us a good approach. Really, it just takes that needle in a haystack to needle of a pile of straw. Kind of helps the lab zone in a little bit. We compared a control sample to the suspect off odor sample. We like to do that so we can see really what is different between the two. That's really what we want to hone in on, is what is increased in the suspect and what is decreased in the suspect sample to really give that off odor. And in this sample, what you can see on the right, we did SPME GCMS to do a full scan GCMS of the two samples and compare them. And you will see in the suspect, which is the pink, is that there is an increase in 2-ethoxyphenol and guaiacol, and a decrease, it's a little hard to tell, but there is a decrease in ethyl vanillin, vanillin, and piperenol. And the ethyl vanillin, vanillin, and piperenol are what we expect to give that flavor of the smoothie. And the 2-ethoxyphenol and guaiacol are actually precursors of vanillin and ethyl vanillin. So what we concluded overall is that there was either some degradation of the vanillin and ethyl vanillin, as well as potentially some processing where the precursors were not completely converted into the vanillin and ethyl vanillin prior to addition to the smoothie. In this case, a consumer discovered an oddly colored fruity drink with an unusual aroma. The drink was expected to be a red color and have a fruity flavor, and what they found, it was a little bit purpley. And so what we did initially is, like the last time, we did an off flavor analysis, very similar to the off odor, where we're doing full scan GCMS to see what is different in the volatile profile of the two samples. And as you can see from the top in the pink is a suspect, again, that there is a large peak for isopropyl alcohol and 2,4-dichlorophenol. And those are not expected to be in a drink. Those are most commonly found in cleaning products. As well, if you look at the bottom chromatogram, what you're seeing is an LCUV of, we have a screen that looks for different FD&C dyes. And you would expect to see the red because it's a fruity flavor, kind of like a fruit punch flavor. We would not expect to see blue dye in that flavor. It was not on the ingredient label anywhere. The blue dye was unexpected to be seen. But the thing that does have a lot of blue dye is cleaning products. Think the glass cleaner that's on your shelf in your pantry. So what we concluded in this situation is that the fruity drink was actually contaminated with a cleaning product. In this example, there was a suspected contamination of the samples during processing from a lubricant. We have seen more and more of these types of investigations come up. Either there's some sort of a lubricant or a coolant that they're suspected to be contaminated, or also very frequently a clean in place chemical that's not completely removed or is improperly diluted that is suspected to be contamination. In these cases, what we really want to look for is, I want to get my hands on the SDS and really dig into what is the best approach to detect whatever material is suspected to be contaminated. Each material, depending on what the chemistry is, may be a different instrumentation platform that we need to use. I also want to look at, what is the best marker for that contaminating substance. By looking at the SDS, I can see what is the ingredients that are listed and which is the best one that I can hone in to really get a good detection. In this example, we actually had a sample of the hydraulic oil to use as a reference sample. So what you can see here is the top is a standard of the oil. So we made a 1 ppm standard of the hydraulic oil that's suspected to be contaminated, and then compared it to different samples. And what we found that there were 2 of the 6 samples that we tested did have contamination of this hydraulic oil. And what this allowed the client to do is to isolate those 2 lots of sample, but be able to release the other 4. So instead of having to dispose of all of the lots of material, they're able to determine exactly when the contamination occurred and just dispose of those lots. Since the pandemic, I would say we've seen an uptick in the amount of materials that are being put into aluminum cans. This occurred for many reasons. One is that we are now using, the consumer market demand for beverages has gone up, especially like pre-made beverages. Think of the cocktail mixes that you see, or NA beverages has gone up quite a bit. Pair that with some supply chain issues that were ongoing during COVID and thereafter, and a lot more cans are leaking as a result. Frequently, this is because, as Martha pointed out earlier, that the materials being put into the cans are not as well vetted as you would normally like to have when you have a product go to market. Perhaps the container, you used to be in a different type of container, and now moving from glass to aluminum cans, or the previous can that had been used is no longer available to purchase to be able to use for the product. And so this is resulting in more cans leaking. So in this case, there was canned alcoholic beverages that were leaking, and the client reached out to us to determine what was the root cause, because it's just leaking in the storage warehouse. So the first thing we did was to pressurize the cans to visually look for the leak. So we could pressurize the cans and then look exactly where the leaking is occurring, so we can identify those areas. We also looked at the integrity of the liners of the cans by doing electrical conductivity. And then we looked at those areas of defect. So using, just microscopy, so you can see one of the images there is blisters inside the cans of the, inside the wall of the can. And then we also use SEM EDX and FTIR to look at the compositions of the can and the liner. And what we found is that the cans that had leaking and blistering, there was actually an increase in the iron and the copper underneath those blisters. So what we've helped the client to conclude through kind of a root cause analysis was that inside the can, before the liner was applied, there was the iron and the copper were not removed properly before the liner was applied, and therefore the liner wasn't able to adhere properly, and over time it was causing this blistering, and then the blistering was causing leaks. In this last one, a consumer pointed out that there was kind of, they called it wispy ghost-like floaties. The descriptions that consumers provide are sometimes very entertaining. In this case, they call them floaties in this pepper flavored spirit. And this occurred 3 to 6 months after bottling. And, we took a look at the floaties, and we were able to isolate them by using Teflon filters. Our standard is, if we can see it, we can identify it. Often clients will ask me, well, how much material do you need? And I say, can I see it? And that doesn't even need to be that I can see it very easily with the naked eye. Perhaps we have to filter it out to be able to see it. We have multiple different filters, multiple different colors of filters. In this case, as you can see, it's really lightly colored, so a white filter would not be appropriate. But if we use a black filter, we can then see those tiny little particles on the surface of the filter to be able to identify it. In this case, we use micro FTIR of those quote unquote floaties. And what we did is we did a comparison of the product pH as well. So the pH at bottling and the pH 6 months later. And what we determined with the FTIR is that those floaties, the 4 materials, were a mix of dextrins and pectins that over the course of time were precipitating out of solution. So they weren't present right after bottling, but then later they were showing up due to changes in pH and UV exposure of the spirit. So what we were able to help the client do is to reformulate with a different flavor compound that wouldn't precipitate out a solution, and then this has no longer occurred. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for listening in. We're getting close to kind of the top of the hour, but I want to thank everyone for listening in and joining us today. Thank you, Amy, for hosting us. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. The question is, I have 2 email addresses here. One is for kind of chemistry, the other is micro. You can contact either, and we'll make sure you get to the right team. We also work together quite a bit, so there are times when the investigation calls for both of us together, and we're all getting out together and finding the best solution for you. That's really what we're here to help with. With that, we will take questions.
All right, great. Thanks so much for that presentation, Val and Martha. And we have had some questions come into the chat here during your presentation. So I just want to start with a few of these as time permits. So the first question that has come in, how much sample is required to identify foreign material in a beverage?
I can take that one. As I said, if we can see it, we can identify it. You know, as long as we can isolate it, that's the biggest thing for us, to make sure that we're just looking at the foreign material. We have lots of techniques that we can use, very small amounts, you know, FTIR, SEM, EDS, microscopy. So we're really able to get teeny, tiny specks of things. So generally it's not an issue for us.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question that has come in, what are the most common contaminants or foreign materials found in beverages that you see?
Most common is, you know, we see metal fragments or artifacts. You know, think about a manufacturing line. As those things age, they're gonna start to grind, and you're gonna start to see some issues occur. The other thing is plastic or kind of elastomeric shreds. You know, these are commonly from what I've seen is, you know, a little piece of an O-ring or filters that are starting to get to the end of their usable life, and they're starting to kind of shed particles. And the other kind of, as I talked about, is oils and lubricants or clean in place chemicals. And this really a lot of times is from a user error, or there's, you know, an O-ring that's suddenly leaking and you don't discover it until 24 hours, and now you've processed a whole bunch of material through this line, and then you discover the issue, and then, oh shoot, how long had this been going on? So you have to kind of back calculate where you saw the, you know, where did you test last, where could the issue occur? And it might be testing multiple lots, or if you see it over the course of a run, you know, you do get a middle end to sort of get down to where the issue started. And then we're always able to help with that.
Great, thank you for that response. And I think I'm just getting caught up on everything here. There's about time for 2 more questions, so I'll just ask those right now. The next question, how long does a typical beverage investigation take?
So it's really going to depend on the situation. You know, as we said, everything is unique. We really, you know, there's no boilerplate one size fits all solution. Really what we want to do is, as soon as you know there's an issue, contact us. Contact us right away. You know, the longer it goes on, the worse it gets, as you all know. So contact us. We'll make sure that you get, you know, in front of the right people. We get on a call with you as soon as possible. You know, if you reach out, let us know how bad this urgency is. You know, is this a $2,000 problem? Is it a $300,000 problem? You know, if you've got stuff that you've got sitting in a frozen warehouse, let us know. You know, as soon as we know the urgency, we know, like, do we need to get on a call on a Saturday afternoon, or is this a Monday morning problem? You know, those are kind of the information we want to know. We want to get you that answer quickly. As far as how long the investigation will take, you know, we like to ballpark about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on what needs to be done. You know, if we need to culture things, you know, Martha's team, that may be a little longer. She can speak to that, but for chemistry, it's usually about 2 weeks. However, everything can be expedited depending on what your needs are. Do you have anything to add, Martha, with that?
Yeah, I would say that we can expedite things as much as possible, but we do have to allow for the organisms to grow either by subculturing or by plating. So that can add a little bit more time, a couple days to a week. But otherwise, I would say it's about the same timeline.
Great, thank you for that response. And I think we have one more question here that has come in that I want to wrap up with. So if a customer is using a co-packer, is it the co-packer's responsibility to test for or alert to the possibility of allergens in the environment?
I think you'd want to really have that relationship with your co-packer such that you're disclosing those items in between you. I mean, ultimately, it's your brand. So you own the ultimate onus on it to make sure that what you're putting out there in the market is what you say it is, and that it's safe, because ultimately if there's a recall or there's something that's non-disclosed, it's going to be your brand on the line. So knowing what your co-packer is doing and making sure you have that relationship is is paramount. But there again, making sure that they are doing the proper testing that you require of them is key.
Great, thank you for that. So looks like we are all caught up. Thank you, Val. Thank you, Martha, for your presentation today. And thanks everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Amy.
You too.
Thank you.